this is also in connection with the chip war, because whoever has the dominance over chips has the military and the economic might. And that's really what the fight is about. We're having to consider that this year, and 60% of the world population will vote. And in many countries, democracy is on the ballot.
We're talking about the issues of economic growth in the U.S. and abroad, trade wars with China, the ongoing trade wars, and the prospect of de-dollarization with our next guest, Sandra Navidi. She's the CEO of BeyondGlobal, where she provides strategic advisory services. Prior to that, she held positions as an investment banker, a general counsel, and consultant. And she is the author of several best-selling books, including Superhub, How the Financial Elite and Their Networks Ruled the World, and Future IQ, Your Success Strategies in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Welcome to the show, Sandra. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me, David. Delighted to be here.
I want to talk about some of the themes from your book. Very interesting work that you've done there. And I want to start by talking about your outlook on the economy. So you told me offline that perhaps you're seeing some indicators for a turn in the economy. Now, as you know, there hasn't been a technical recession in the U.S. yet. Is it still in the works? Are we still getting one, you think?
Well, I think it isn't entirely clear yet. A lot depends on the policies of the Federal Reserve. So far, growth has been pretty steady and strong, albeit slowing, but that was intended by the Federal Reserve policy. The consumer is still strong, and that is primarily due to the labor market. The U.S. is still at full employment, and this is all against the backdrop of steadying global growth. And the U.S., as in the past, has shown to be a growth engine for the rest of the world.
You know, in the U.S., it's been the only country that hasn't seen a recession in the G7 bloc, at least not from a technical basis. All the other countries that I can think of in the G7 countries have had some sort of technical recession in the last year and a half. Why is it that the U.S. was the exception?
Well, I think it's not entirely clear yet if the U.S. will see a recession, but we're still in a soft landing. And when you talk about a recession, it very much depends on also how long and how deep a recession is. Not all recessions are the same. So if we were to see continued economic slowdown and we would get into a recession, I would expect it to be rather shallow. But the U.S. is in a very unique position. It has the exorbitant privilege. It provides the world's reserve currency. It is still the preeminent economic and military power. So I feel the measures or aspects that would, come into play for other economies don't apply to the U.S. to the same extent. So I think the U.S. could scrape by, and if it were to fall into a recession, it would probably be manageable.
Before we continue the discussion, I want to take a minute to talk to you about today's sponsor, NordVPN.
On this show, we regularly cover how to grow and protect your assets, but one of your most important assets is your privacy. Every investor needs to protect their digital privacy and footprint against hackers and potential viruses. According to Chainalysis, 2022 was the biggest year ever for crypto hacking, with hackers stealing $3.8 billion in cryptocurrency. And according to Duke University, more than 80% of U.S. companies claim to have been successfully hacked. One of the best ways to protect yourself and your privacy online is with NordVPN. Not only does NordVPN hide your identity online from malicious actors and criminals, but it also comes equipped with malware protection. NordVPN also prevents you from accessing dangerous websites, allowing you to enjoy your favorite financial content securely. And the best part is that it is easy to use. Just download and click. NordVPN is available for your phone or computer, and they're currently offering 65% off on a 2-year plan plus 4 extra months. Simply click on nordvpn.com/DavidLin in the description down below to learn more.
We have to talk about this ongoing trade war that may or may not impact the economy. So just yesterday, news came in. President Joe Biden, I'll just read a paragraph from Bloomberg here. President Joe Biden's administration is expanding the use of secondary sanctions on Russia with an eye toward curtailing the sale of semiconductor chips and other goods to Russia, targeting third-party sellers in China and elsewhere, as it looks to further choke off Vladimir Putin's war machine in Ukraine. So the context is slowing down Putin's I guess, war machine in Ukraine, to quote the article. But what he's actually sanctioning is Chinese manufacturers, right? So to what extent is this going to hurt or harm the U.S. economy in any way?
Well, the US is in a privileged position, so far the tariffs haven't really bitten back. But of course, usually the damage that you do to other countries, especially in terms of tariffs, comes back to haunt you because it becomes a race to the bottom. In the case of Russia, the issue has been the sanctions have been effective as insofar as Russia hasn't managed to evade them. And a lot of evasion has gone through China. But more generally, what we're seeing is that economic measures, and particularly tariffs, aren't only an economic consideration or geopolitical consideration. They have become a fundamental security consideration. And this is also in connection with the chip war, because whoever has the dominance over chips has the military and the economic might. And that's really what the fight is about. Full stop. At the same time, though, the two superpowers, the US and China, are so inextricably linked. President Biden has to be very careful, very strategic as to how he imposes tariffs, because he doesn't want to inflict too much damage, just so far that the Chinese may swallow it and not strike back with measures that would in turn totally hurt the US. And I think so far, President Biden has managed this balance pretty well.
Well, if both sides want access to these chips, and Taiwan is really the place right now that is producing the most advanced chips in the world, doesn't that lead to a geopolitical issue, Sandra, in terms of reunification with Taiwan and what the U.S. may do in response?
Yes, it's a thorny issue, and that's why Europe and the U.S. are being so stringent with Russia, because they fear they might set a precedent for China. If Russia gets away with invading another country, then China may be encouraged by that. But what we're seeing with regard to Taiwan is Taiwan produces 56% of all chips worldwide and 90% of the high-powered chips, of the sensitive chips. So there have been bipartisan voices here in the U.S. who have said, okay, if China were to occupy Taiwan, then we will attack and bomb those chips facilities. Now, that proposition wasn't particularly popular with Taiwanese politicians, right. But that goes to show you the sensitivity of this issue, that the chips war, the access to chips, the capability to produce them is really decisive when it comes to world dominance. And that is why Biden has enacted many of those laws, also the Critical Capabilities Act. And like, for instance, the U.S. has many of the rare earths here in the U.S., but they haven't been gotten out of the earth. So they need to produce plans. Plans for chips are very complicated to build. So this Biden basically started all of this. And I think that makes total sense.
What we're also seeing is sanctioning of Chinese companies, and the Chinese are doing the same with U.S. companies, where they're banning the rivals companies, right? The latest being TikTok, and Huawei was before that. You're a legal expert. You have a law background. You worked as a general counsel. Can you just comment from, I guess, a lawyer's perspective? Is this like legal? You know, if you for a company to just be banned in a country? What is there, you know, can they do anything about this?
Well, you can argue anything. And I think with regard to TikTok, the national security implications are a strong argument. Now, whether or not that's really convincing, if that's really true, is another question. I'm not entirely sure about that. But what we've seen also in the war with Russia is how much things have changed. We've seen geolocation issues, for instance, you know, being able to track down soldiers or population with regard to their smartphones or dating services, or, you know, now electric cars are becoming data collectors and give information to foreign powers. So things that we didn't even give any thought to before, now we're realizing how sensitive they can become in a crisis. And I think that is the backdrop. And legally, you can basically argue anything and just try to draw it out.
Can we expect an escalation of more companies being banned from either side, Sandra?
I think the trend is towards an escalation. I think it very much depends on who the next president will be, because I think for investors generally, with regard to the US, one of the greatest risks is the political risk. And that was also shown with the rating agencies, the three big ones who either have downgraded the US or put them on downgrade watch. And the results of the next elections are very binary. Either we're going to continue on a path of continuity with President Biden or whoever the Democratic candidate is, or President Trump will come into office and basically turn everything upside down. And it's not just Trump, it's the Trumpists who have conquered the Republican Party. It's not your grandparents' Republican Party anymore, the more measured Republicans. And that doesn't reflect on Republican voters in the country, but the political establishment these days and the Republican Party is very extreme.
Well, going back to the trade wars, it seems that neither party is backing down on tariffs against China. So, as you know, when Trump was president, he implemented protectionist measures that put tariffs on Chinese goods, and the Chinese retaliated. It doesn't look like Biden's administration has fully retracted from those policies. They're still implementing them. In fact, like I just quoted, in some instances, they're escalating these policies. So can we expect this trade war with China to continue then, full stop? It doesn't matter, regardless of who wins in November?
Yes, protectionism will continue to the dismay of Europeans, by the way. But the difference is with the Biden administration, tariffs are very strategic and fine-tuned, and you can negotiate and talk to the other side. Like there's a working group with Europe with regard to auto tariffs. They haven't come to a conclusion yet, but at least there is dialogue, and there isn't real animosity. With China, it's a little less benign. But still, I think Biden would be measured. Now, the advisors of Donald Trump, we know from the past, Peter Navarro and Robert Lighthizer are pretty extreme. 60% of tariffs on Chinese goods would be extremely, would be elevated cost for the U.S. consumer. And then Robert Lighthizer has said these kinds of tariffs, whatever we say, it's just a beginning. The end goal is like 100% or prohibitively high tariffs, just so that those goods won't come to the U.S. anymore. That also, that would be a disadvantage for the U.S. consumer, not only because goods would be more expensive, they would also become less available. So forget your French cheese or your treadmill from China for just a couple of $100. And then also it's bad for a competition within the U.S. If a washing machine producer doesn't have to compete anymore with foreign producers, then they can increase their price. They don't have to invest as much anymore in research and development. So all in all, it's a bad development for Americans.
Well, what you're saying is we should roll them back. What is your suggestion? If you were in the White House, what would you do?
No, I think, either you have free trade and free trade agreements. That would be ideal, but that's politically completely off the table. We're having to consider that this year, and 60% of the world population will vote. And in many countries, democracy is on the ballot. And if you have less democratic governments, more protectionist, more right-wing governments, like we are seeing in Europe, those types of political parties have a more protectionist and isolationist agenda. So that's bad for trade. I think globalization has sort of gone a little out of control, and globalization gains have been too inequitably been distributed. Too little or too few of the gains have come to the population. So I think a more controlled globalization does make sense. But to completely deglobalize doesn't make sense and wouldn't be good for security considerations either.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but you brought up a good point. So yes, this year, many countries are hosting elections. What general themes do you expect to emerge from after this year, and perhaps any changes to our global world order following this year's elections all over the world?
I think we're seeing very clearly the prevailing of more autocratic governments, because one of the main problems pretty much all over the world, in Europe and the US, is migration. from the global south. And that will only get worse with with climate change. So more and more people are coming, and we're having a problem with uncontrolled migration in both of those areas. And politicians haven't really heard people. But so migration is a problem, and inflation is a problem. And inflation is also due to structural changes, longer lasting, like demographic trends, deglobalization to some extent, or I would say the alignment, transformation of trading patterns, put pressure on prices that national central banks have very little control over. And that's led to the discussion over whether the inflation target should be raised from 2%, if 2% is too stringent, and if central banks try to adhere that, they may stifle their economies.
What signs are you seeing, going back to what you said about globalization, what signs are you seeing that deglobalization is now happening?
Well, I think a deglobalization in terms of complete decoupling is impossible, but we're seeing a de-risking. That is something that Europe picked up from the States, so they're trying to de-risk. What does that mean? That means decreasing dependencies, especially through diversification. So yes, we still have production in China, but we're also doing it in another country, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. India, of course, is a great beneficiary here in the States. Do it closer to home, friendshoring from Mexico. So I think what we're seeing is not deglobalization, but a transformation of globalization and a globalization. So people are more careful with regard to where they choose to produce and assemble and sell from.
First, there was Brexit, and then we saw protectionist measures in the U.S., and of course, the Chinese retaliated. Do you think this can escalate to become a more global trend where countries are putting barriers to trade, countries are putting sanctions on each other, raising tariffs, and so on and so forth?
I think contagion has been a global trend, but I don't think it encompasses all countries. There are countries, especially in Southeast Asia, who have benefited. So basically, the US and Europe have tried to diversify away from China. So India is a great beneficiary, and other countries. So it doesn't apply to all countries to the same extent, but definitely it's been a trend.
Do you think that de-dollarization is happening right now?
Well, I think that's also been a trend. In the year 2000, 70% of global currency reserves were in the dollar. And then 2 decades later, it's just barely 60%. So the trend has been to diversify. The euro makes up 20%, and the renminbi is just 3%, has been for a long time, doesn't really change. So I think generally speaking, the US dollar will remain the preeminent currency. And why is that? Liquidity, availability, convertibility, safe political institutions, legal safety. So I think all these things play into it. Now, ever since the European Central Bank and the Fed have impounded Russian currency reserves, that's been a little bit of a shock to the world because that broke a taboo. Now, emerging countries have taken notice of that, thinking, if we don't dance to America's tune, then who knows, next our currency reserves might be frozen and we don't get access to them. So that's an added incentive to diversify away from the dollar. On the other hand, the US is such a strong economy, and the dollar is still, the best dirty shirt in all amongst all. So I think over a longer time horizon, the U.S. dollar will take a smaller part of global currency reserves, but I think that'll be over a longer time span.
So, but a net 18% of global central banks, this is an article from the Financial Times, a net 18% of central banks globally plan to increase their allocation to the dollar over the next 1 to 2 years in response to U.S. interest rates remaining high, according to the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, a UK-based think tank. At the same time, demand for the renminbi, the Chinese renminbi, has stalled among central banks, halting a trend of recent years where more central banks had aimed to add exposure to the Chinese currency. What do you think is going on? Is this political, or is it purely economic? Is the article implied it's an issue of interest rates being high?
I think it's a mixture of all. Like I just cited the impounding of or freezing of Russian currency reserves. So that's, of course, political. But then again, the US is the strongest economy. I don't know if it's going to be 18%. That's the estimate of one think tank. Others may come to a different result. I haven't researched it, but I think for the foreseeable future, the dollar is pretty safe.
Now, I would like to learn a bit about your books. We have a few minutes left. What are some of the themes that you can share with us from Superhub, How the Financial Elite and Their Network Rule Our World? What are some of the major takeaways?
If I might say, it was one of Bloomberg's best books of the year.
Yes.
An international bestseller.
Congrats.
Well, in the book, I try to explain the financial world with network theory. And I say that basically all systems are networks, and the nodes in the center exercise the greatest power. And those nodes in the financial world are CEOs of financial institutions like Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, or central bank governors like Jerome Powell, or finance ministers. And I tried to explain how this basically small exclusive club pulls the lever of global finance and the economy. And that basically gives a view behind the scenes, like what I have witnessed, especially when I work with Nouriel Roubini and later family offices and other influential figures. Try to give a picture of what people don't ordinarily see. Now, if I were to write this book today, I would shine a light on the technology industry, which I think has taken part of the power of the financial industry and is becoming increasingly more powerful.
And Future IQ, your success strategies in the age of artificial intelligence. Is this a survival guide for how to keep our jobs, or what is this book about?
Yes, I tried to show where the world is going with digitization and artificial intelligence, and how we as individuals can position or should position ourselves in this new world. I think that there is currently an AI hype. Not everything that can be digitized or AI'd will be digitized. There will still be plenty of jobs for humans. And in this book, I try to portray which skills and qualities will be future-proof and safe from machines, because we will always value them and humans will be indispensable also in this new world.
Okay. Where else can we follow your work? Do you have any upcoming books or posts that we can look forward to?
Yes, I published a book actually a couple of years ago, The DNA of the USA, where I tried to explain how the US got to this point where it's currently being, because all over the planet, I'm being asked, how could the US get into this position with Donald Trump and everything? It's an enigma to most people. So I tried to explain culturally, historically, and from many other viewpoints and aspects, how this came to be. And this book, The DNA of the USA, was nominated for the German Business Book Award by the Frankfurt Book Fair last year. And I'm in the process of translating it.
Okay, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm pretty active on social media, particularly on Twitter, where I'm most political, but also on LinkedIn, where I am a top voice, official top voice of LinkedIn, and Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, the usual. But I would say the most informative are Twitter and LinkedIn.
All right, we'll put your social media links down below. So make sure to follow Sandra there. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today, and we'll talk soon.
Pleasure to have been here. Thank you, David.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.